Today's video is all about recoil. So in Modern Warfare 2, they have a bunch of different recoil properties: horizontal recoil, vertical recoil, stabilization, steadiness, smoothness, control, and then also there's aiming stability and idle sway. I'm not going to talk about those two in this video, but I'm going to try to cover all those different recoils. This video was an insane amount of work because I also went into visual recoil and tried to quantify that using a million different things. So really appreciate if you drop a like on the video to help support, but let's jump into it and we will start talking about recoil and what these different terms mean. All right, so starting with stabilization here, this is a stock M4 versus an M4 with maximum recoil stabilization. Recoil stabilization is one of the properties that we had in Modern Warfare 19. It was on the Commando foregrip, which was like the best attachment for long range. The reason for that is because it really helped with like the visual recoil, as well as made the recoil path as it went up much more like tight to the line you would expect, so that it was more predictable. Basically, it was less bouncy around that line, and it really seems to just make long range guns much more accurate. So I try to not go into this with preconceived notions about how these might work, but it is the same dev studio, and I expected at least something relatively similar. So we're starting with the stabilization, and this is 330 rounds fired, where I started in the exact same point and just shot up. Let the recoil do what it wanted to do, so we could see kind of an outline of where the bullets ended up over a huge number of trials. There's obviously more important things that we're going to talk about that are going to be on the next few pages, few slides, but I thought this is an important measurement for some things. So basically the left and right pairs are exactly the same. It's just one's outlined with the red and one's not. You can see it doesn't really seem to be doing much on this. It's pretty consistent. It's maybe a little bit tighter left to right throughout the recoil pattern, but it doesn't do anything vertically, and really doesn't have much of an effect overall in the 330 round test. It's also really important to look at individual recoil patterns rather than like the conglomerate of 330 rounds fired at the same starting point, like in that last slide. So in this one, that's what I did. I did 5 recoil patterns with each type of recoil control. So we've got stock versus max stabilization. On this slide, we're going to be doing stabilization for the first few points here. So you can see on this one, it does seem to be doing quite a bit of work. So it's kind of there's some horizontal recoil help that you can't necessarily see if you just shoot the same recoil pattern over and over. So there's less sharpness in the recoil, so it doesn't change direction as quickly. But overall, not a huge difference here. But any sort of horizontal control or reducing any unexpected like jumps from left to right, that's huge for long range accuracy. So it does look like it's helping with that somewhat. I would say it doesn't look like it's really doing nearly as much as it did in the past in Modern Warfare 1 and Warzone 1. In Warzone 1, the Modern Warfare guns had the Commando foregrip, and that was like an essential attachment, and that was because of the recoil stabilization. It really helped with visual recoil. It also helped with just like the horizontal bounce around these recoil lines. So it doesn't look like it's helping nearly as much in this game as it did in Warzone 1. All right, so now I'm going to try to explain how I measured visual recoil. Quantifying visual recoil is extremely difficult, and that's why it took me like 3 full days to make this video, even though I only was testing like 5 different stats. Visual recoil is just a nightmare. So I'll run a little clip in the background right now so you guys can see what I'm talking about as I'm doing this. But basically, I measure 3 different points on the screen using a Python program that I wrote. I can track different images on the screen. So I look at the bottom left, the top right, and then I also measure the reticle in the center. So what that gives me is 2 different types of visual recoil. So there's one type of visual recoil where the screen is translating around and shaking around, and it's usually like a rotation. So if I measure the bottom left and the top right of the screen, I can see how the screen rotates through time if I just calculate the angle between those 2 points. And then the other thing that I talk about that I measure is the reticle. So there's also a component to visual recoil, which is how much the gun is shaking rather than the screen is shaking. So I measure the reticle bounce and basically the magnitude of where that's jumping around throughout the firing process. Trying to quantify visual recoil is a very long process. Basically, I would measure it first in Python using that screen tracking, and then I'd have to take it into MATLAB, clean it up in MATLAB, do a bunch of signal processing on it in MATLAB, try to get the peak-to-peak values. So the amplitude, basically, I wrote a program that can find these amplitude peaks, and then take an average across the whole 30 rounds of the magazine. It's just a crazy process. So again, If you guys appreciate all the work I put into this stuff, don't forget to drop a sub, like, and a comment on the video to help me out. But let's go into it and talk about how these actually came out. All right, so recoil stabilization, this is the angle that I was talking about. So bottom left, top right measured, and seeing how much that shakes around and changes that angle throughout. The blue line is the stock, no attachments, and then the orange line is with max stabilization. And you can see that these look pretty similar. There's really not a whole lot of difference in magnitude or anything here. And my code that spits out the average amplitude across all these different peaks and valleys showed that. So it came out 0.0084 for the stock with no attachments, and then max stability came out 0.0085. So really no effect on how much the screen is rotating and torquing as you're firing. All right, on to the reticle bounce now. So reticle bounce, like I said, I actually track the reticle in the center of the screen as it's bouncing. It's very difficult to do this because it's violently shaking, and I force the game to run at 240 FPS locked there, and then I get 240 FPS recordings. So that makes this possible. But even with that, the data is not perfectly clean, so I have to smooth it all out. And that's what this came out. So the top is the stock. This is the magnitude of reticle shake. So it's not like how much it's shaking X direction or Y direction. It's the magnitude of both of those combined. So you see the stock average amplitude came out to 0.732. Using that same amplitude program that I wrote for angles, it can be tweaked so it can work for anything. And then the max stability average amplitude came out to 0.56. So that's like a 20% reduction in how much the reticle was bouncing around. And this is something that was present in Warzone 1 Modern Warfare 19. The stabilization attachments helped with that visual recoil a lot, specifically the gun bouncing around. So it still has that in this game, it appears. All right, now on to the steadiness builds. So for max steadiness, I actually did two separate builds. One was with the Bruin Warrior Grip, and that is the pattern you're seeing in the middle. And then one was with the VX Pineapple, that's on the right. And you can see that compared to stock, these definitely have a vertical recoil component that they're reducing. Pretty similar amount of vertical recoil reduction between the two. But the VX Pineapple also had a very, very significant consistency help. So it's much more consistent, made the pattern basically almost straight up rather than being much more jumpy around left to right. And we'll see that on the next slide as well. So on this slide, you can see that this is the Pineapple build on the right. And these recoil patterns are like almost straight up and super, super consistent. So steadiness seems to be doing a ton for the overall consistency and magnitude of recoil. I think it's going to be one of the top recoil components that people should be trying to get for Warzone 2. Onto the visual recoil, we got the screen angle. So this is the visual shake. Really no big change here. So the average amplitude of stock was 0.0084. Average amplitude of steadiness was 0.0087. So it was actually slightly higher. I think that's just error in the measurement, but really no change there. Then onto reticle bounce. So reticle bounce was again identical. So steadiness seems to be helping a lot with the actual recoil. The recoil pattern on the wall is much more consistent, much more straight up, and just lower in magnitude overall. But for both visual components, the screen shake and the reticle bounce, the values were just identical to the stock guns. So it's helping with actual recoil, but not really with the more intangible screen shake and gun bounce, things like that. All right, on to smoothness. So recoil smoothness is on some of the suppressors. Basically here, I think it doesn't look a whole lot different. There's obviously no change in vertical magnitude, maybe a slight change in horizontal magnitude, but on this picture you can't really see much. So let's go to the individual recoil patterns. So these are the individual recoil patterns, and these ones look a little bit more straight up and down. So I think smoothness is kind of smoothing out that pattern a little bit, taking away any sharp jumps that it might have. Like you can see in this pattern on the left in stock, like there's a sharp jump to the left, and then that's just never present when there's any smoothness involved. So that's the biggest thing I see smoothness helping with. Looking at the screen angle of smoothness, same story here that we've seen everywhere else. Really just no difference. It looks pretty much the same repeatedly, and the average amplitude comes out actually a little bit higher in this case. So it came out 0.0089, so it's like 5% higher than the stock. So that could just be error in the measurements, because honestly these measurements, 240 FPS is even at 240 FPS, it's not like perfect data. It's very noisy data, so I have to do a bunch of smoothing and stuff to get this to work out correctly. So there's going to be some error involved in that, of course. So that 5% could just be error, but it could also be increasing the screen shake. I don't know. It's hard to know without seeing the actual code on the back end. Onto reticle bounce of smoothness. So it did seem to help with this a little bit. So stock 0.0732 average peak to peak amplitude again. And then the max, this is supposed to say smoothness, not stability, but the max smoothness average amplitude 0.068. 0.68, so it's a little bit less than the stock amplitude, but again, that's only like 7% or something like that, so that could be 6 or 7%. That could be just error. I would say that, I mean, I don't know what the error actually is in this, but there's definitely going to be error in any real measurement, so it's possible that that's just error in the measurement. Last up, we have Recoil Control. So Recoil Control has obviously been in the game for a long time, and it always has done the same thing where it just basically shrinks the recoil pattern. But really, there's a bunch of different components, like I've said multiple times in this video, that go into each attachment. It's not like it's just recoil control. I'm sure there's other stuff involved in a lot of the attachments. Some of them might just be recoil control, but a lot of them are probably basically different combinations of these different components that they can tweak on the back end of the game. But it's really hard to know what those values are, so I'm going to try to test all this stuff. But right off the bat, you can see that recoil control is helping dramatically with both horizontal and vertical recoil, just in the overall recoil plot here. It's also very consistent compared to the stock recoil of the M4. Looking at the individual patterns, it doesn't seem to make the patterns as consistent and straight upright as Recoil Steadiness did. So in a lot of ways, I think Steadiness is going to be a better attachment, but remember that Steadiness didn't have any effect on visual recoil at all. But the recoil patterns look pretty similar with Control versus Steadiness. I don't have the screenshot for the max control build, but you can see that the average angle amplitude was 0.0084 for stock and 0.0082 for, this is supposed to say max control, not Steadiness. But yeah, it's really no change here. 0.0002 is not enough of a change to really say anything is different. And then onto reticle bounce. This one actually I do think is significant. So stock was 0.732 average amplitude of the peak to the values across the whole recoil, the whole 30 rounds of the recoil. And then for the maximum recoil control build, it was 0.65. So that's like a 10% reduction in the amount of reticle bounce that you have, which is pretty significant. So overall, yeah, recoil control is mostly just a shrinking of the recoil that you actually get, but it also does help with your how much your gun bounces around a little bit. All right, so to summarize all of this, we've got all the different 330 round spray patterns up on screen here. So from left to right, this is the stock M4, maximum recoil stabilization, steadiness 2. So these were two different builds for maximum steadiness. Recoil smoothness, recoil control, and then the far right is actually just with the VLK4X. I wanted to see if they still reduced that, basically just the overall recoil. That's something that the optics, the high zoom optics in the past have done for pretty much the last few games. So it looks like now they don't really do much, which makes sense because in real life an optic wouldn't reduce your recoil. Like, they did that because it makes it really hard to see. There's a lot of visual shake and stuff at higher zooms. But for this game, it looks like they haven't done that. I only tested the VLK, so there might be other ones that do, but really no impact there. But I'll go more in depth on optics later on. But recoil stabilization looks like it didn't really do much for the actual wall spray pattern anymore. It's more of a how much the gun shakes. It really helps reduce that, and it also did seem to help a little bit with like tightening up the pattern horizontally a little bit. Then recoil steadiness seemed to have a pretty significant effect on vertical recoil, and in some cases also really tightened up that pattern. So with the VX Pineapple grip, had a much more consistent and tighter left-right pattern than pretty much all of these except recoil control. Recoil smoothness was kind of hard to tell if it really did anything. Didn't really seem to do much. Maybe a slight amount of reduction in like the horizontal recoil, or how much it could how hard it could change direction as it went up the pattern. But really, if it had anything to do with that, it was a pretty small amount. And then recoil control seems to be, again, a shrinking of vertical and horizontal amount of recoil on the wall, but it also helps with that visual gun kick, the amount the gun bounces around as you're shooting. So Again, I think all of these have little components in the back end that are probably combined, and they're just kind of trying to give us hints at what those combinations result in by giving them different names: stabilization, steadiness, smoothness, control. But I do think it's not going to be consistent between all of these. I think it's kind of like it's like a continuum. Like, it's not going to be like one thing does this, then that means another attachment that has stabilization also exactly is going to match that. Like, I think it'll be different between attachments, even if they say they do the same thing. And this VX Pineapple versus the Bruin grip is a perfect example. Like, these both said they helped with steadiness, and the little green bars in game were about the same for what they did, but dramatic difference in how they actually affect the recoil. Visual recoil summary. So screen angle, basically none of them seem to have much of an impact. Stock 0.0085, and then recoil smoothness was like 0.089, 0.9, things like that. So really not much change in screen angle at all. I would say that none of them are really affecting that. But reticle movement, I'm pretty sure is pretty dramatically affected by some of these. So recoil stabilization had a 21% reduction in reticle shake. Steadiness did nothing for reticle shake. Smoothness did about 6% reduction in reticle shake, and then recoil control did about 11% reduction. So I think recoil control, steadiness, and stabilization, they're all going to be important. So stabilization is more of a visual gun shake reduction. It doesn't seem to do that much anymore outside of that. Steadiness seems to do everything except visual recoil, and then recoil control seems to kind of do everything. So it does a little bit of everything, but mostly it's just shrinking of the entire pattern. And then smoothness just kind of doesn't do much. It looks like it maybe does a little bit of horizontal tightening of that pattern and making it a little bit more consistent and less jumpy around as it goes up, but not a huge effect there. So I think the three we're going to be looking at mostly will be steadiness, stabilization, and control, but they all have their own little pluses and minuses. All right, guys, again, insane amount of work went into this, so I would really appreciate likes and comments on the video just to help support with the algorithm. But yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot, and I will see you on the next video.